Hey everyone, this is Elliot Olson, along here with my co-host Matt Nickols, and you've joined the Multi-Location Marketing Podcast. We're super excited to have you back for another episode. Today's episode, we are going to be talking about important things to consider when developing a multi-location marketing strategy. And so we're just going to get right into it. I just figured why beat around the bush. So Matt, if I am you know, I'm putting myself in the position of a, digital marketer at a brand that has maybe 50 locations or 150 locations. And I've been tasked to put together an ideal local marketing strategy. Where do I start?
Great question. So, what I tell people generally and what we found works really well is the first place to start is kind of putting yourself in the shoes of one of your local representatives or locations, right? Because at the end of the day, nothing else matters to them, right? And I see a lot of people take shortcuts at the beginning or think about, well, how would I execute that, and they get worked up about it because, oh, that's going to be too hard or take too much work. And which, is a legitimate thought, but there are so many great tools out there, ways to automate things. And we'll get into a lot of that, throughout this podcast. But I would really encourage you to just think, hey, I'm in Denver, Colorado, or I'm in San Antonio, Texas, or Indianapolis, Indiana. Pick one of your markets and say, if budget were no object and effort were no object, what would I do? What is the ideal local marketing program for this location to succeed in doing what we do, to selling it, building awareness, connecting with people that are looking for what you're doing, what's the right messaging to convert them, et cetera. So I think that's the key. Think about that you're one location. Now, the one caveat to that is you want your strategy to be broad enough to cover everything that, the majority of your network would be doing. So for example, sometimes a location might have products or services A, B, and C, and another location may have, C, D, and F. They overlap some. So just think about it in terms of like being wide enough to cover like anything that they would sell, at the local level that you need to market at the local level. And then those things can be kind of slotted in where certain locations might have a different product mix than others, but you want your strategy to be broad enough. The other thing that I like to encourage people to think about is that the program has to work if they do nothing at the local level, because that's pretty much what you're going to get. Us, in our experience in working with, lots and lots of multi-location brands is that, the vast majority of people are going to do nothing at the local level, So you don't want your strategy to be dependent on them doing something. Now, it always helps and it can add value if you can get local participation. But, in general, no, they're just not going to do it. They're not going to respond.
If you ask them to update something on the website, or you create a banner and you want them to publish that on maybe a local website you've created for them, is that going to happen most likely?
No. I mean,
No.
you're very hit or miss.
No.
So that's something really basic. If you try to ask them to do a blog post or something, forget about it. There are ways to make things easy for them. Sometimes you'll get some participation, especially if it doesn't have to be super timely, like, their installation photos or, some of the charitable things they're involved in locally, but we try to, define what those are and set them up at the beginning of a program to give it that localization. So those things are important to know, what things are going to be different at the local level. But we'll talk about this, but, we need to have ways that we can impact that centrally, and anything that we want them to do at the local level needs to be kind of additive, right? Not like a foundational element, because, they're just not going to do it and you can't really force them to. There are different tactics you can use to try to incentivize people to do things at the local level, but generally you don't want to rely on it just because it's not going to happen.
I mean, there are one-off. I mean, we don't want to say this and say like, oh, I'm just thinking in my head, Matt, like, I have a friend who works for she's a massage therapist, and they have multiple locations. She books a lot of her business through Instagram. So obviously there's exceptions to the rule. In general, though, if that company doesn't have some sort of centralized, strategy that they're working on to try to support, their different, getting leads essentially, or people on the, people booking massages or whatever, then, they're missing out on that way.
Well, yeah.
And a lot of other companies,
if you're an entrepreneur and you have a local business, I mean, you're going to be a lot more motivated, because if you don't do these things, your business is going to die on the vine generally, right?
Yeah.
You have to, so every entrepreneur has some level of marketing capability that they do, or they're generally hiring a local firm that's helping them with the strategy, and they're putting it together. So that's exactly what we're trying to do. We're trying to think like, I'm an individual local business, and if I hired, an agency, or, we put together a strategy, what would that look like, for us? And, those tactics can be really valuable. But generally, it's kind of the 80-20 rule, or I call it the 95-5, or, the people that are actually going to do it, because they just don't have the time, and energy typically. And if they're a dealer or a franchise, they feel they're buying into a system, and that system should be doing that for them. So you probably even have less than, an entrepreneur that's on their own. And that's really, if you think about it, what your business is competing against, right? The individual entrepreneur that set up a business, and maybe, they've paid a local agency to be doing a marketing strategy on their behalf, which is very common, right? Or they've hired somebody, or they've learned it on their own, and they're implementing these tactics. So as a national brand, we have to be able to compete in each local market against those types of businesses that it is their lifeblood, and they're doing it on their own, and they're learning it, or they're hiring somebody. So that becomes really important. Now, from one of the advantages we have as a national brand is that generally we've had bigger budgets to develop assets, across, our national brand. So we'll have good photography, we'll have video, we'll have, some good content, infographics, and we'll have developed some tactics that we've seen work, whether it's digital advertising or social media tactics, or, content that we've done, content marketing, so that's the advantage that we have, is that we can develop these assets, and we can continue to develop assets because we have 50 or 100 locations that are feeding into our marketing budget, whereas a single location has one, right? So we should be able to outdo them, right, in terms of quality, quantity of assets, great content. So that's the power that we have as a national brand that we can use. And then the trick is, how do we leverage those and localize them and use them at the local level to impact things locally? And there's some tactics that we can think about. But what I want to encourage you to think about when you're developing your strategy is, I'm in one market. What do I need to do to really dominate this local market? And then, as we start to put some of those things in place, we can think about, okay, how do we do this at scale? How do we vary things up between
without it having to be dependent on a local rep?
Exactly.
That's another, yeah.
Yep.
Cool. So, okay, so we've kind of got this idea in our head. What's next? What is it? A local website? Is there something before that happens? Is it?
Yeah, I mean, the cool thing about a local website is it really becomes the embodiment, right, of what you do as a business. So there's no other marketing tool that more fully encapsulates, what you do, where you do it, the visual aspect of the brand to build credibility, pictures, content, all geared at really selling the consumer on what you do, why you're the best option, answering questions for them in a way that's really powerful, that can mix, static elements, multimedia, video type elements together. So the website, really is that embodiment. And so that's always a good place to start to think about how do we position, what we do, in the local market. And that could be a standalone website. It could be, something that's within the corporate domain. There's pros and cons to each approach, and we can talk about that. But the other thing that I would do, right up front is do a little local marketing intel, right? Do some searches, on the web for the products and services that you're offering and see who's coming up as competitors. Who are those top 3 or 4 listings in the search results? Look at their sites. What are the things that they're doing? How are they positioning themselves, as a local business, and what are they doing? And that gives you, kind of a good idea of what you're competing against and kind of what you're up against in your program and what your local reps, are competing against. And so that's a good way to kind of get a baseline of what's being done in the local market and get some ideas flowing. So I think that's, a really good tactic to use. And then, when you're thinking about that approach, it's really the first thing is defining those core products and services that you're selling into that market, right? So what are the core handful of services and products that you are going to market, and then really breaking those down by the target audience, right? So that's really understanding. And if you're a national brand, you've generally probably done some of those exercises. Who's buying your product? What's the demographic look like? And that becomes really important, to define, for each of those products and services. And that really allows you to kind of get, a map of what are the things that we're marketing, in each of those local markets, and I think.
And what's our messaging and.
Right, exactly. What kind of is your core value proposition? Most marketers have gone through, these types of exercises, but it really does start there. You can, develop buyer personas, if you want to go to that level, in your audience, but you kind of know who you're speaking to. And that's usually another advantage that a national organization will have, is that they've done a lot more thought into those areas. They know who's buying, they know, what messaging works. And those things will, by and large work at the local level. There may be a slight twist on it, depending on, for example, your imagery is going to be different in Miami. You don't want to have pictures of mountains in Miami, and you don't want to have pictures of palm trees in Denver, right? So you either have to have neutral type things, or you have to get, some more regional type imagery and things like that you're going to use. And so, that becomes a way that we can do those. So I would say defining those, is kind of that first step. And then, the target audience and then the messaging. I would think the next step, is really like, what are the ways we're going to reach, that target customer? And, brainstorm all the ways that the channels that you can use to reach them. So this would be like organic visibility, for example. So we want to make sure that we're found in search. If people, if I'm a pet salon, right? If people type in pet grooming or pet salons, like, I want to make sure that we're there, right, as an option. And that's a way people will identify. If they look for our brand by name in the local market, we want to make sure we're there, right? So, that's one tactic that, is obviously really popular. And again, I would say organic visibility, I generally recommend that be a foundation of any local marketing program, because it provides several advantages. One, it's earned, so it's more trusted by consumers. It's evergreen. It's always there. It doesn't go away when your budget runs out, like in digital. And it's typically a lot wider and deeper in terms of the types of things that you're found for, longer tail terms, those types of things. It's very trusted by consumers. So it generally produces a very high quality business opportunity. You're targeting people that are actively looking for what you're doing, and it's very trusted, and it's typically the highest value, type of lead as you start to generate organic visibility, because you're not paying per click and those types of things. Obviously, social media, depending on your industry, can be a very important way to reach people digitally. And then, and it can be very targeted. So, that's a great thing, both geographically as well as, demographically, right? And there are other digital channels. There's a lot of social, obviously Facebook's the 900-pound gorilla. You've got Instagram that's closely associated with Facebook, but you've got some other up and coming channels depending on, like your TikToks of the world, your Snapchats, depending on who your target demo is. There are different platforms that can reach those groups. And then you've got, your display advertising that you can do, which really helps you, on different kinds of focused content sites to be able to reach people. And again, you can target demographically as well. And then you have your traditional mediums, your offline things, radio, cable television that allows you some, targeting capabilities, outdoor, direct mail. Believe it or not, direct mail is still one of the top handful of tactics that are being used and dollars are being spent on. So that becomes important. Newspapers, people use things like money saver coupons to target people. And then like local publications and things like that. So, there's a wide range of tactics, and you've probably as a marketer used different things effectively. But the key is zeroing in on that local market. How can we do things to really target people, in the local areas that we want to reach people. And then, one of the great things about, your localized strategy is you can use things that, really speak that local language and bring them back to some type of a local landing page that clearly communicates, hey, I'm in Denver. I see mountains. I see architecture that looks like, my neighborhood, those types of things. And what we found is that traffic to a localized, landing page, web presence converts generally 30 to 40% higher rate than national traffic. So that localization is really important. If you can show a picture of the manager of the local store, the person they're going to be dealing with, again, you're furthering those connections and you're really bringing in localization. So as we think about that ideal local marketing strategy for Indianapolis, think about those things. How can I localize that experience to really produce that local feel and that local connection and trust with the consumer? That's going to get me a long way towards being, more successful, in each of those local markets.
Right on. I mean, I think one question that's coming up with, you kind of answered this, but I know if I were sitting and I were listening to this, I'd be thinking, man, there are like so many different things I could do. And I get the idea of obviously doing, a buyer persona kind of an idea and trying to understand my local market. But how do I, are there a couple big ones that, big tactics that you would recommend? I mean, I think you said like a website or a local web presence being one of them. Are there other ones that you just see a lot of franchises using more regularly that are just worth, like, I'm going to get more bang for my buck than kind of maybe trying to, I mean, I know, again, maybe some of these niches, like really, outliers aside, is there something that, are there a couple more areas that you would invest in?
Oh, sure. I mean, so much of it depends on that target audience and the product that you're selling, the radius that you're marketing to, so every business is a little bit different, but clearly, some of the really popular and effective tactics, I would say, again, I said this, but the foundation being organic visibility that's earned, it's trusted, it's high value, it's always there. I always recommend that as a foundation. So, you could call that search engine optimization, organic visit, but it's using search to connect with people that are actively looking for what you do in that local market. And that gets you really zeroed in on the market and the product and service. So if you're, in the HVAC space and people are looking for AC repair, boom, you got to be there, right? You got to be there. And really in those top 3 spots, in the search rankings are what get the lion's share of all the traffic, And then, if you're not in the top 4 or 5, you're really in the low single digits of, the traffic that you're getting. So it's not just having a strategy. It's like you have to have a strategy to be in the top 3. And if you're not there, you're in essence, invisible, and you're losing a lot of that market share. So that's really critical. Digital advertising is huge because we can, again, target it really specifically. The problem that you run into a lot of times is in competitive spaces, those terms get bid up really high. So, and you've got to decide what budget am I going to use. And you have to have a really good handle on having a lot of expertise into really, focusing in on those keywords that are converting, the right demographic, because it's super easy to burn through, a lot of money with nothing to show for it.
Right. Like, is this worth it? Is it worth going after these terms, or is there another, or not terms, but
or paying this dollar amount, for
right.
it. So you got to really understand the value that a customer is bringing, the lifetime value of the customer. Are you willing to invest in a, break even or negative cash flow situation on gaining and acquiring a customer? Because if you're not, a lot of companies are thinking that way. And so they're willing to, pay more for a click than you might be. How do you effectively use Facebook, targeting wise, so you really have to have good metrics in place. And you have to really focus on dialing that in. And then how do you scale that and use what you're learning, across all those, your local markets, and, making those things as locally relevant as possible, because just a few percentage points in conversion, can make or break a campaign in terms of its profitability or not. And so you've got to really use every tactic at your advantage. And so again, you want to focus on doing it for one location, what would be ideal. And then there are tactics that we're going to talk about on how you can do that across 100 locations with great efficiency. But, you have to have the strategy dialed in, for a single market. And then we can talk about scaling it. Direct mail, it can work really well because there's less of it. It tends to get through really well. And there are ways that we can integrate and tie that back into a digital strategy to get attribution, with tracking numbers and things like that. It really depends. I mean, those are, I think, some of the big tactics, right now that we still being very effective. And again, each of those, we could talk for hours about each of those, but
it's kind of interesting. It's kind of interesting. Yeah, it's kind of interesting with direct mail, especially because it's like you'd think that would be something that would be dead, but it's like very alive in certain industries. And I'll just say too, something, you've been at this a lot longer than I have, Matt. But one of the things I find really surprising in calling into and talking with different franchise, digital marketers and franchises and different multi-location businesses and just meeting different people is that, there's some organizations that are very, very like their systems are super refined. They know how to measure attribution. They know how to measure all the data points. They know what's important to pay attention to. And this is probably going to be something that we're going to create another episode about, but as a local marketer sitting in your seat right now, thinking about how you're going to help your organization, especially if you're somebody who's, maybe you've done local marketing at an agency and, you've gotten hired to do local marketing for a national brand. The devil's in the details, and so much of it is really learning to measure and know what to measure and to be able to see what's happening and make changes and so obviously that might sound kind of basic, but there's a lot of people that really struggle with that. They're like, there's so many different things happening. Knowing what to pay attention to is just a challenge for them. And so I would just encourage anybody who's in that position as well to just realize that is a real thing. Like if you're feeling like you're running around with your head cut off, like try to understand what you actually need to pay attention to in terms of like what you're measuring and the different tactics that you're using currently. And when you're having conversations with people and you're trying to implement new stuff, like learn the language, learn how your agency of record that you're working with is measuring stuff, and be able to speak into it and really know it. Like, don't just depend on them to just tell you how well you're performing, for example, in SEO or something like that. Like, really start to become a student of that, and that's going to serve you really well. So I don't know. I just wanted to mention that too, because I've
that's a good point. That's a good point. And I would always also encourage, generally, depending on your experience level, you got to crawl before you walk, before you run. And a lot of it can seem intimidating. But in general, if you can focus on, creating that ideal web presence that is localized and really tells the story in a powerful way, and then, pick some tactic. You can start with a single tactic that's going to start driving traffic there. And, you look at the whole thing as a funnel, right? So we know the audience, we're reaching out to them through whatever tactic that we're using, and then we're driving them to that local web presence. And that's where we talked about what is that image and that brand to build credibility. And then what's the message, the who, the what, the where, that you're doing. And so as you break down, that's kind of a good segue into the next segment, is that, you have to really understand, that web presence. So you're always driving them back somewhere, no matter what kind of channel you're using to reach them. You always have to send them back somewhere to tell more of the story, right? Generally, or they can pick up the phone and call, which is great, or they can go into a location. But if they're going to be doing any further research, you got to send them somewhere where you can tell more of the story. You can talk about the offer. You can get them to do some kind of an action, right? Whether it's chatting with somebody, or it's picking up the phone and calling, or it's filling out a form, to request something. So that can be a landing page, that can be a full local web presence, but you're sending them back, somewhere. And that's really important. That web presence is, what is that right message for each of the products that you're selling? And then, I always think about it like, if I were a consumer wanting to buy this, what is every question that I might have before I'm willing to take the next step? Right. So I remember, several years ago, I'd moved into a new home and I was looking at, in-ground basketball goals. And I did a search online, for basketball goals in my market. And some pages came up where there was a few pictures of the basketball goal, a short description with a few bullet points, and that was it. And I was like, I didn't have enough information to confidently, take a next step. So I just hit the back button on my browser, went to another site. And, after looking for a few, I found a site that had this full, great pictures of it. It talked about the thickness of the glass and why that was important, the rim, the breakaway system, the crank, the system for bolting it into the ground. There were informational points that I didn't even know to ask, and they covered everything that I could possibly want. The pricing was fine, and I ended up, making a purchase. Right now, in reality, the first basketball system that I looked at could have been better. But they didn't take the time to think through and answer my questions and educate me before, I made a decision. So I went with the company that did that. And if you think about that at the local level, that's what's happening every day as consumers, right? We're searching for something, we click through. If you build credibility, you answer the questions that they have, you educate them, and then you give them a clear path to an action, then they're going, to have a much higher probability of converting. And so, in this step, you determine the audience, you determine how you're reaching them. Now it's, what is that right message? Do I have the right content? Am I answering the questions? And then I'm really developing a way to communicate that value proposition in the form of a web presence to convert them, in the next step of the sales process. And if you do that effectively, you're going to have a, really good success in converting them. And, as you're developing that, the other thing, so that's kind of the approach for the human audience, but we also have another audience, and that is for search engines and bots that are coming in and indexing our site, that's determining what is your site about and how, and that's that search engine audience that you really need to think about, because that's going to determine, what search terms you're coming up for and connecting you with those audiences that are looking for, what you do in your local market. So that's really, doing keyword research, understanding what, Google has gotten a lot smarter, in that they kind of group like things together now. So you don't have to think about every exact term, but really more like keyword groups, like based on a subject, right? So if I was doing AC repair, air conditioner repair, I would think about all the different terms, in that group. And there are some ways you can, some great tools online that you can use to kind of do some of that research and kind of ascertain, where the search volume is. But you want to really define that and then kind of create these keyword groups. And then as you've created that, those subjects, you create kind of a sitemap or, an outline, or we call it a content architecture that really defines, each of these core products. And then you kind of map these keyword groups to each of these pages. And so the idea is you want to make sure you have a page that, at least one page focused on each of these keyword groups that are important to your business. And that really helps you define, between that for the search engine audience and what you need for the, the human audience in terms of just the marketing content, sales content, and converting them, that kind of develops, what that ideal local web presence is going to look like. And then, from there, you're really thinking about what calls to action do I want? How am I going to get them to take that next step when they're ready? And that depends on, your product, the complexity.
Right.
It could be getting them to come into, like I said, the location, picking up the phone and calling, chatting with a live human, doing a form fill. If you're really looking to get somebody interested in buying now kind of a thing. But you might also have educational types of things that they're doing, like download a white paper or some gated community or a promotion or a coupon. Those are all things, that can really vary. But in each of those, what you want to do is get that user to identify themselves, who they are. So then we can either continue marketing and nurturing them, or, obviously call them back if they're interested right now. And so, that's kind of the next step of the process is, compelling calls to action, getting better at that. And then, if there is follow-up that needs to be done, having a lead nurturing program can be really effective as well. Sending out emails depending on what step of the sales process that they're in, all the way till they become a customer and you close the business, right? So that's kind of, the marketing strategy funnel, if you will. And then I think it's really critical that you have tools in place to measure each step in that process, right? Because if we can squeeze a few more percentage points out of, each step we want the consumer to convert to, out of the end, it's going to produce more revenue. So putting in place, the right kinds of KPIs, performance metrics in each step of that process is really going to help you to be able to identify that at the local level, so you can see that at each location, but then rolling those up, whether it's regionally, obviously, and then nationally, or by types of locations that you have. There's a lot of ways you can slice and dice the data, but it's really important that you can see across your entire program, how is everything working? How am I ranking for different search terms, which can influence, your content strategy and what you're doing to improve rankings in those areas. How are these certain ad campaigns converting? How many leads am I generating? So all that marketing data can be really powerful at your fingertips if you have it. And that kind of goes to what you were saying. You can see it locally, you can see it nationally. You can look at, show me the underperforming markets, show me my top performing markets, and then you use that data to refine your program and get better and better results over time. And When you do that, that's where you really start to see the magic happening. And then as you get more comfortable in running these programs, you're like, okay, I got this down. I'm doing a good job with my SEO. I'm converting at a pretty good rate. Now let's start adding in some digital media spend to kind of fill in the gaps, some digital ads, at that local level, and to build more awareness that people might not know, what we do. You can start rolling in some direct mail. You can start doing a social media program, right? So these are all things that you can kind of do over time, put in the metrics to track and measure them, and then, continue to dial them in so that every step from, the first outreach is converting, getting them to the website at a higher rate. The website is, doing a good job of communicating the value proposition, getting them to convert to an action, and then once we know who they are, now we're nurturing through, and then, how are we converting them to close? And, imagine the power of being able to see how that's working across each of your locations, and then being able to impact each local market to get better and better at each of those tactics. And when you're doing that, you're just going to see tremendous gain. So, I've heard it said many times that if you want something to improve, the first step in that is start to measure it. And you got all those metrics in place and you're measuring it. And then you can look at ways to improve each step of that. And, you start with 100 people and, you convert 10%, that's 10 that are in your pipeline. Well, if I convert 12% now, I've got 12 in there, right? So that's 2 more people that I'm using. And then if I convert those at a 50% rate to the next step, that's 6, right? Well, if I up that to 60, it's more, it's 7. And then 7 people, going down to the next step. And if I convert half of those, then, 3.5 of them. But if now I can move that number up, again, as I move each number up, at the end of the day, the result is going to be more sales, more revenue are going to drop out of the bottom of the funnel, which at the end of the day is what we're all about as marketers. So that's how it works, at a really high level.
Yeah, I like that. Well, cool. Well, thanks for that explanation. I think we are up for our time right now, but we will join everybody next week. Hope you guys got a lot out of this episode. Very excited to continue to produce some content for you guys. We got a bunch of ideas in the pipeline here, but hope you have a great day. And we will talk to you on the next episode of the Multi-Location Marketing Podcast.